I'm Councilwoman Joanne Ryan. Welcome this evening to the Special Commission for Taxation and Revenue. Regular meeting Monday, October 23rd. It is 5:19 p.m. Sorry for the delayed start. We had some copying that we needed to do. Madam Clerk, could you kindly read the roll?
Chairwoman Joanne Ryan,
Present.
Vice Chairman Michael Villiers,
Present.
Councilman Pedro Espino,
Present.
Councilor Sue Engelbart, present, Lawrence Mancini,
Present.
Sharon Connor Wells,
Present.
Jane Driver, present, Tom Squirrels,
Yep.
Robert Schultzman.
Present.
We have 9 present, we have a quorum.
Wonderful. Thank you to the clerks for the extra effort in getting those copies to everyone. Could you kindly read the first item into the record?
Item number 1, broad discussion regarding the city's tax structure, revenue sources. Following has been invited. Seth Williams, PFM Group Consulting LLC.
Okay, so Mr. Williams, could you come to the table? We're going to get you sworn in. We're going to pass out the matters. Pass out the presentation. I'm sorry.
Please raise your right hand. You swear on the penalty and perjury that the testimony that you're about to give will be complete.
I do.
State your name and your number. Very much.
Seth Williams, PFM Group Consulting.
Please have a seat, Mr. Williams. Okay, while our clerk is distributing this package, what exhibit, Madam Clerk, what exhibit should this be? I like that. May I have a motion to call the multi-page PowerPoint presentation entitled National Resource Network NRN Providence 10-year plan revenue discussion on a number of pages exhibit I. May I have that motion? Motion made by Vice Chair, seconded by Councilman Espinal. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Aye. Motion carries. We have the exhibit in our record. Welcome.
Thank you.
We're elated that you were able to fit us into your busy schedule. This is a really important discussion for us, for this commission, as well as the city of Providence. For a number of weeks, we've had really good discussions about the budget, revenue, the components of the budget, our revenues, and one big piece of it was a discussion of the NRN report that was done many years ago. And when we first started, I was going to hand out the 140-page document, and then I read it and thought better of it, because I didn't want to bog everyone down with a report that was aged, if you read. Not that it wasn't important, there were many important components to it. So I asked the administration if they would be kind enough to reach out to you and get you in to talk about salient points in the report that may be relevant now. Given what we know and where we've come from, I think it's an important discussion. With that, I welcome you to the commission. After you make your presentation, we'll have an opportunity for the commission members to ask you questions. And we'll go from there. So please take it ahead.
That sounds great. Well, thank you for having me, Madam Chairwoman and members of the commission. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. The report, while it was many years ago and several gray hairs ago, I think some of it still is important and hopefully contextual for the work that you all are doing. And the city should be commended for looking at projects. I think it's a bad practice to consistently evaluate what the options are, because we all know when this report was written 7.5 years ago, nobody had an idea of what COVID was. Nobody had an idea of what the next 7 years would bring. Nobody had an idea of what ARPA or IIJA might bring. So the world can change fairly fast. And consistently reevaluating, always having a finger on the pulse of what your risks are, but also what your opportunities are, is a really important aspect of good government, and you all be commended for making the time and effort to do so. I appreciate the opportunity. Chairwoman, as you noted, the report was done under the banner of the National Resource Network. The National Resource Network was a federal government initiative, started in the Obama era. That was one pillar of a multi-pronged strategy to help economically challenged communities try to round the corner and be a hand up. And it provided technical assistance opportunity that was heavily federally subsidized. So in this case, it was 75% federal government funded and 25% local government funded. Which in Providence was actually raised by philanthropy. And so the company that I'm part of, PFM, led the work. We were the technical assistance provider to the city through that engagement. And it resulted in a 10-year financial plan. Part of that 10-year financial plan was really to help level set for the city what its financial challenges were. This is 2015, rough timeline when the work was happening. So we're still kind of coming out of the Great Recession. There was a lot of inherent uncertainty and a little bit of softness certainly in the housing market at that time, but also in the general government sector. Was this the new normal? As you remember back, revenues had declined and had kind of just teetered along, but never really hit that increase that everybody was hoping for. And so at the time, we did a 10-year projection because at that point, it lasted beyond the horizon of any one elected official. That this was really a document that was meant to be a governing document, that would be a living, breathing document evolving with time. And so a key part of that was projecting what the city's financial picture looked like from a revenue standpoint and from an expenditure. As you may see, if you page through the report, not the one in front of you right now, but the thicker report, there was gap. And like any other community that we work with, closing that gap required some hard choices. It required hard choices that the city's done in some instances. In other instances, there were some hard choices that the city didn't anticipate, the report didn't anticipate that happened, COVID and other such things. There were other contextual realities that happened. Right? At that point, the schools were part of city government and were part of funding. So the context of the report is pre all that, right? So the things we're going to talk about tonight are agnostic to it was not something that was conjured up, and certainly the report didn't cover that. Those things evolve. But I think some of the pillars that we'll touch on tonight, especially the few areas that I want to focus our time and attention on, still remain challenging, still remain an opportunity for the city to think about. Doesn't mean it's the city must do this or else. But I think there are several opportunities the city could consider, and if it makes sense, then you could consider it as part of your copy. Well, I'll start on page 5. I think I'm trying to be efficient with your time, knowing that you have a lot of other matters.
Excuse me, Madam Clerk, could you close the door for us? Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem.
Also, let the record reflect that we have Councilman Sanchez who has joined us. So, thank you. Please continue.
Sure. So the discussion, and as I mentioned, tonight's discussion does not consider any of the factors that have happened since 2015. So take that with a fairly large grain of salt it is as we walk through. But at that point, what we found, right, is Providence has very limited ways to raise revenue. That's not uncommon among local governments. A lot of it is set at the state level or local government you're talking with, but Providence is certainly in that category. One of the key factors in Rhode Island is for some of the special local option capacity revenues that other municipalities around the country would have availability to access. In Providence, in Rhode Island, those communities don't. They have to have special authorizing legislation from the state to pursue some of those new revenue streams. Another key factor that we found, not news, but important context, is the role that Providence plays in the state. As the capital city, it is both the cultural capital the physical capital, the entertainment capital, the transportation capital, among any other variety of sectors that being a city of its size and the size of the state of Rhode Island would carry. And so Providence has a special role and it carries more of the burden. It's enormous benefits, right? Having world-class institutions, having arts and entertainment, having thriving restaurants, scene and entertainment, those are wonderful attributes for the population. But Providence also attracts visitors from around the country. Providence also attracts residents of Rhode Island, other residents in the region and neighboring states as a cultural capital. Those have very tangible impacts on the delivery of government services, whether that be infrastructure, whether that be, things like traffic, whether that be things like public safety. Those things are very real, and those come at a cost that currently, in 2015 and 16, and as that's my current knowledge, that has not changed. That Providence residents shoulder a fair burden of that, and so that, coupled with the significant presence of active tenant parcels in the city, further constrains the ability of Providence to raise its revenues and balance its expenditures in the way that some other communities across the country and even within the state have. So if we flip to 86. As we went through the work, one of the goals of it was to try to better match the tax burden for residents and businesses with the benefits needed to provide the services that residents, visitors, and businesses deserve. And that's an inherent tension in any government. It's not easy anywhere you go across the country, but in Providence, it was a little more acute for the reasons that I noted. And we identified several, what I'll call buckets, for lack of a more appropriate term, of options for Providence. One was around collection rates. Do a better job of collecting what you do. And I think the city has taken action. To the best of my knowledge, the city has taken actions on many of those. Adopting new sources of revenues, I'll come back to that, and it's the reason it's highlighted. The pilot agreements, if I followed the news accurately, it seems like that one's been done for in recent months, right? There are new agreements in place.
The education, not the mess, we're working on that.
I'm sorry?
The education, pilots,
Yes. Yeah.
not the mess.
Should not be missed. And then the final bucket, the fifth bucket, is looking at what assets the city has and thinking about how it manages its current assets. So those are the 5 buckets of potential revenue options. I think 4 of those, and actually, I'm sorry, I said 5, it's 4. I think 3 of those have been or are being addressed in various ways. The one I want to focus our time on that I think might be most appropriate for your focus as a commission is on the second one that's highlighted, the new sources of revenue, and inherently in there is figuring out some of the fair share discussion I had alluded to earlier in the conversation. As part of the report, we really spent some time considering how to distribute some of the consumption economy to the users rather than the residents. And that's a hard conversation to have. And so we looked at best practices at that time around the country. We looked at some comparative cities across the country to identify options and opportunities that did not exist in Providence at that time, and where they could be brought to bear in furtherance of both city policy and city finances. And so the 4 that I think might be most germane today are 4 that I identify on page 7 of the recommendations around parking fee or tax and admissions fee or tax, additional meals and beverage fee or tax, and cigarette and plastic bag fees or taxes. Now, I know in the interceding time, some of these things may have changed, some of these things may not. That is where I don't have that context, and I have not been engaged to do that work in the interceding 8 years So my knowledge gap stops at about 2016. So forgive me if I'm repeating something that history has already taken care of. But the construct for those were opportunities where there are beneficiaries who come to Providence or maybe reside in Providence, but are taking part in something that has an impact on the services that the city provides. And there are ways to structure that help to balance those expenditures, broaden the cost burden, and increase the revenues to help offset those costs. We did not recommend that the city, we didn't make a recommendation, I should say, that the city adopt some or none. That the goal of the report was really to give city elected and appointed leaders options to make choices. Some of these may be great ideas, some of them may not fit with the vision of Providence that elected and appointed leaders have. That's the kind of point, to have that discussion from an informed standpoint around a series of policy choices. And then you go make the best decisions for the Providence that the voters, the residents, and the businesses here deserve. So what follows on the next 10 pages, I will not read through. It's adopted in the record and you can review it at your leisure. But I'm happy to hit the high points on these kind of local consumption-based revenue ideas. The most important caveat that I can put on all of these would need, at least at the time of this report, would have needed state authorization. These are not things that the city of Providence can do on its own. This is a state, may I do this? We need enabling legislation in order to do this. So it comes with that very, very significant caveat. One of the things that you'll see with each of these revenue ideas is we tried very hard to tie them to investments so that it wasn't a tax for a tax. Why are we collecting this money? We're collecting it to offset our costs. And what are those costs? And or invest in X. Now that X could be defined multiple different ways. Generally, it's strongly preferred to have a nexus between tax and use of proceeds. So from a parking tax standpoint, one of the things that we noted was Providence had an outsized number of surface parking lots. That has an impact on how you use land. How you use land has an impact on how you raise revenue. How you raise revenue has an impact on the services you can do. And so we focused on parking tax on investment in capital. That we suggested that proceeds from that be reinvested in the city's capital infrastructure. That was the general idea. And you can see on here the various other cities at the time, what their parking tax rates were, and the estimated amount of revenue that would generate annually and then over 10 years. Obviously, this is 8 years ago, pretty old data. Trends have changed, so I would take this more as context than as proof positive from a number standpoint. But that was the key part of the discussion at the time. On an admissions tax, that really goes back to Providence being a creative capital, to being the entertainment hub for the region. A growing number of cities at that time, and I think still true today, and maybe even more so today, have identified an opportunity to levy it. I almost think of more as a fee because it's recouping the costs associated with hosting large scale events for entertainment. Largely it comes from things like public safety, traffic management, road use, and such things that have real impacts on the municipalities that host those functions. Those can be structured as either a flat fee, a percentage of the ticket. Obviously now, as many more things go digital, it's an internet-based economy now. Things are happening online. It's less of go to the box office and purchase your ticket, but it's a point of sale. It's essentially on a ticket of admission, whether that's an electronic vehicle or whether it be a paper ticket. But the goal is to help share that work because not every person attending an art gallery, attending play or attending a concert or sporting event. It's from the city of Providence, and they're a real income. So that's the intent. Moving on to the meals and beverage tax. Currently, I don't believe it's changed, but to the best of my knowledge, with the 1% tax on meals and beverages. Correct me if I'm wrong, and apologies if so, but I believe it remains at 1%. But we looked at that as an opportunity to increase it by a nominal amount to generate some money for the same exact reason that we think about the emissions tax, right? It's a cultural capital, it's a culinary capital. Providence has some outside restaurants, and that's thriving, and it does wonderful things for the city. It also has a real impact on the city's budget and the service divisions. So there again is another opportunity, hopefully from a nominal amount that would not dramatically affect or impact the level of activity in that sector, but make a meaningful impact to some of the costs that are associated with hosting the significant benefits that derive from that industry. Flipping ahead, a cigarette and plastic bag tax. Again, as with all the state levels, I understand that there has since been a plastic bag ban in Providence, so we can likely strike that one. And as I said, context can be right. So the
Saved us a lot of money on that tipping fees too, by the way.
I'm sorry.
Saved us a lot of money on that tipping fees. It used to be about $1 million a year. That was my legislation. I'm very proud of that.
Well, then you're to be commended.
Oh, thank you. But it had a big impact.
Good public policy, good fiscal policy.
Good all around.
Yeah. And so we kind of viewed that the cigarette tax, I think a little bit differently than the other revenues that we discussed, primarily because it was really not geared towards raising money as much as curbing some behavior, but also trying to reduce some of the expenditures associated with healthcare provision as part of the city's overall wellness endeavors at the time. That was really where the cigarette tax was generated. Again, obviously you need state authorization to even be able to do so, let alone then the city deciding to do so itself. But it really was from a health and wellness perspective for the city residents. Not something that is unusual. Other cities across the country have done all of these things. It's just the context within Rhode Island and Providence can't do it. So flipping ahead, if you look at numbered slide 9, I inserted the report slides in between, so apologies for a little bit of confusion in numbering there. The last several slides, I think, are my attempt to share some context on how to think about revenues, not to suggest that you already don't have that at your fingertips or have the expertise to do so, but more working with local governments across the country for longer than I care to admit. These are some kind of tips and tricks that I've seen along the way and I found helpful. And if it's helpful for this commission as it proceeds with its work, I thought it was useful to put them in and read at your leisure. Feel free to discard at your leisure, but offer it as some humble advice from experience. And walk through that generally if it's helpful, or just leave it for the record and you're
Through it, please, if you wouldn't mind.
I'm sorry.
Please walk through your recommend tips and tricks. We like to hear them.
Sure. It is the trick season, right? So from an evaluation standpoint, I generally try to think about revenues from 4 different parameters, and they're kind of really on the right side of this page. And that's thinking about, okay, how much are we talking about from a public policy standpoint? Are we trying to recover our costs? Are we trying to subsidize something? What are we trying to do by implementing this? Is it a public behavior that we want to encourage, so we're willing to subsidize something? Or are we trying to recover the costs and fully recoup the costs because it's not something we're trying to encourage or discourage, it's just a recoup of the costs associated. So thinking about what the policy goal is and tying that to the revenue, I always try to start there. That helps you orient and make a good decision or a better decision. Then economic feasibility, I think, is sometimes one that becomes a little bit of a tug of war in policy discussions. Especially when you think about things like elasticity, and as you get into, this is going to curb that behavior. Literature says it has a negative elasticity of X or a positive of Y. I think it's incredibly important to have a good economic analysis of what policy you're considering at the time. And doing the homework, you not only figure out the number, but the impact behind the number. So yes, we can raise X amount of revenue, but we'll have Y amount of impact, of negative impact on economic activity. Depending upon what that is, that may be okay. Depending upon what it is, that may be really not okay. And so understanding how to balance those two things kind of goes back to the first one, financial flexibility, but really understanding economic impact and viability. Then there's the third, which is sometimes self-evident and other times a sticky wicket in places, but that's the legal and legislative flexibility. Can your jurisdiction do this on your own? Can you not? Obviously, it's a lot of the answer. No, you do specific legislation to do so. And then the fourth one is political feasibility. And sometimes certainly work with clients where it's there have been some challenging experiences because the revenue was really attractive. So let's go ahead and do it. The political willingness was not there, or the explanation for the why had not been done. And so really understanding the why and the what, and then conveying it before proceeding. I think that level of engagement, communication, and discussion is incredibly important, because without it, there have been really good ideas that have gone to die simply because folks didn't understand, didn't have the opportunity to discuss. And once that genie's out of the bottle, it's really hard. So several questions on those slides, and the slides that follow really are, this is my general kind of tax and revenue consideration. So for some of these, Providence doesn't have, you can't levy an income tax on your own, so you can kind of skip over that section for yourself. But as you think about fines and fees, or even property taxes as your major revenue driver, some things to think about in the different levers associated with each of those types of revenues. How to think about making which ones go which ways and what your goals are. I think I kind of always use this and come back to it to ground myself as I'm thinking about, might be a very subset issue of a property tax, but what are we actually trying to achieve? What's the duration of it? What's the impact? What other best practices have we seen? Are we balancing the burden appropriately, fairly, equitably among the folks that will be touched by whatever tax, in this case, property tax. So that's kind of what you'll see on 10, 11, and 12. And then one of the things we as a firm have spent a decent amount of time on as we work on revenues in the last decade in particular, is thinking about how to incorporate equity into revenue discussion. And there's no cookie cutter way that says this is the way to do it. But there are, I think, different dimensions of equity that you can bring to the conversation to ask intentional questions about what your policy choices are. And try to lay those out on 13 and 14 a little bit, but really thinking about what does equitable recovery? You'll see here, I use the term equitable recovery. This draws from work that we did coming out of the pandemic with the Bloomberg What Works philanthropy. And defining equitable recovery is a little bit different in every community, because the needs and the pushes and the pulls look a little bit different in every place. But by asking some probing questions, we found that it helped to advance the ball. That the answers to these questions might be different in Worcester than they are in Providence, than they are in Pawtucket, and that's okay. But the intentionality of asking the questions at the outset had a really helpful impact on the actual policy focus and getting the policy as right as possible. I also view it as a living document, right? And that just as the last 7.5 or 8 years have changed circumstances in Providence, the answers to these questions will probably change in 2 years. Whatever you answer today, we don't know what's around the next corner. We don't know when another recession is happening. And so the balance that you give fiscal sustainability versus burden versus benefit may shift over time as reality, and that's okay. But I think the intentionality of framing the topics with thoughtful questions helps to arrive at a better public policy. So I'm happy to take any questions about the items presented, but that concludes my presentation. Appreciate the time and moving forward.
Well, thank you very much. There was a lot of material and help presented in a very short time. Commissioners, any thoughts, questions, Lisa?
I do not. I'm based in Philadelphia, so it's, I've always enjoyed coming to this.
Well, you are from Philadelphia.
I am from Philadelphia, and I will note that our baseball team is doing a little bit better than the York baseball team. They are actually in the second or third inning now. The record can reflect. But no, I think Providence is a thriving, interesting mid-sized state. I have an interest. A lot of my clients across the country are mid-sized cities that I do this type of work with. I think mid-sized cities are really interesting. Providence is among the most interesting. You have world-class universities. You have a very diverse population. You're a very complex city. A lot of history, a lot of natural beauty, all in one place. I've been in cities that would kill for some of those things. And those are unique advantages that benefit Providence to no end. And when we were doing the report, I think we said it explicitly in the report, Providence has world-class assets. And because of those world-class assets, it has opportunities. Those assets also come with costs. And it's important for the city to recognize, it's important for the state and the region to recognize and balance those two things. There are real challenges, there are real opportunities. It's an interesting place.
Thank you, Commissioner. Vice Chair Tibies.
So thank you for coming. Excellent presentation. Is your firm involved in solving the revenue problems in the city of Philadelphia?
In the city of Philadelphia,
I think we wouldn't.
the city of Philadelphia
We exchange that situation.
yes. So let me be thoughtful in how I answer this. The city of Philadelphia is a PFM client, one of our longest and most valued clients. We enjoy a great relationship with the city. The city is changing administrations, and a new mayor will be taking office as of January 1st. Historically, we've done a significant amount of work with the city, exploring revenue options. We did some work with the city during COVID as well, doing a pretty nuanced analysis of its revenue streams and what may or may not change. And we continue to be supportive in many ways of the city and look forward to continuing that in the next administration.
Councilman Angela.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this presentation. I had a few questions. One was beyond the cigarette tax and plastic bag fees, what other kind of like sin taxes have you seen be successful at the local municipal level?
So I'll give you an example in Philadelphia, not just in Philadelphia, but in Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia both have a meals and beverage tax. And forgive me, Providence has the same, it's meals and beverages, right? It's not just, so there's been discussion. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh have higher amounts than Providence does, and that's, special legislation not allowed for that, as part of those two city recoveries. But there's also been an expansion of gaming revenue that's going in. To the extent that they're host communities, there's been some gaming revenue that has been derived. I've also seen, I would have to do more research on it, or maybe the commission wants to do more research on it, but I believe there is host community impact fees or revenues that go to grow house communities in Massachusetts around marijuana when that was legalized.
Yeah.
The specifics of it escape me. It's been 4 or 5 years at least since I looked at it. I hope I'm not giving you incorrect information, but I believe that's still accurate. I've seen that take place. My own personal, this is not best practice, this is me, Seth Williams, giving you my opinion. I tend to think sin taxes are interesting and an okay thing to avail yourselves to. I don't know how much stock I put in them long term, because behaviors can change. I mean, if we had a sin tax on cigarettes in the 60s, I think we'd be doing pretty well. I don't know what that revenue stream would look like today. If you had counted on it as a major revenue driver. Gaming, in some communities you've seen gaming go really well and sustain and thrive. In other communities you've seen it not integrate itself very well and actually farm economic activity. So I tend to think about it more in the context of total public policy. What are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to attract jobs and economic activity? And if so, what does that take? What does it spin off, both positive and negative? That tends to be how I think about it, rather than, you know, kind of cigarette or alcohol or gambling or whatever some tax you want to ascribe it. Kind of personal perspective on it, I suppose.
Okay. That's one more.
Please.
Thank you very much.
Councilor.
I have one more question for you, and then maybe one for Larry, actually, but, have you, sorry, Larry, Mr. Mancini, you've seen, and maybe this is a weird idea, but do other cities have any sort of bifurcation for commercial property taxes, such that, like, if you're a locally owned and operated commercial structure, like, let's say, Benny's, I don't know, like a local business, that one's gone out of business, so I'm not, not Benny's, a different one. You're paying, it's like a homestead exemption, but for like locally owned business. So like if you're Frog and Toad, maybe businesses you probably don't know too live here, but you're paying a lower rate than if you're the KFC on North Main Street. I know Portland, Oregon did something, and I'm not gonna get all the details correct in my brain, but where they had a special tax on very large corporations that were not based in their city. That only had revenues above a certain amount. And if you were one of those, you were paying like a very small additional tax every year, but it added up to like $30 million a year for Portland, which is pretty significant. And they directed that toward racial equity issues, particularly around climate. Have you seen any other sort of like, and this is my long lead up, like any other sort of bifurcation of like commercial taxes? Like if we do want to encourage more locally owned, locally operated, less of the like, you know, KFC or sorry, KFC, but you know, I feel like I'm really fighting KFC today, but, like, oh, their franchise. Okay. Something that's not owned locally, to better, like the homestead exemption, but for businesses.
Yeah. Quite honestly, no, I have not come across anything like that, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
May just mean that I haven't looked at these items in the last several years.
Yeah, okay. And then the question for Larry is, he mentioned the underutilized assets and selling them. Is that, do we have, and maybe this is more of a question for the properties, but do we have a list of the assets of the city of Providence and which ones are being underutilized or which ones are vacant right now that we own? Like I'm thinking of the fire station on Rochambeau, for example. How many of those types of things do we have?
The city's public property department maintains a complete fixed asset register. Which ones are marked as either underutilized, not utilized or vacant, I would defer to the director of public property, but we could get that information from him. Yeah, I'm sure that some designation does exist.
Thank you.
Can I ask Aaron from our policy shop if you can check in and get that information? For me, so we can distribute it. We'll get that for you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Commissioner Conner Wells.
Thank you. Good evening, it's actually Rich. I agree, great presentation, but I'm thinking about some things that you may have not talked in quite as depth about, because like education. I know people are moving to a town and the one thing that families look at is education and the school system. Did you, in broad detail, see anything that we could think about in terms of bringing more families to the city, increasing grants that we go for education, because it's such a big part of family, and people moving here, which is our tax base. The other question is things like the zoo and things that are educational, but also recreational that families go to. I know families in Boston that have memberships in our zoo. And it's our central park, like New York. I'm just wondering if you thought about those things at all in terms of revenue, taxes, bringing people in.
Yeah, I think they probably fit a little bit in the admissions tax that we talked about. I mean, anything that's ticketed, I think might fit there, from like the zoo with their tickets, right? For those types of activities. One of the things, not a revenue, but it was actually the beneficiary of revenues, was the education system. We talked in different parts of the report about different ways to invest in youth. Doesn't necessarily need to be, can be the school system itself, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. I think in the report, we actually talked about creating a youth innovation fund or a youth investment fund. I can't completely remember the name that we ascribed to it at the time. But taking a portion of revenue, because the construct that we put in the NRM report was that achieving fiscal balance isn't enough. Providence needs to oversolve for its gaps that it can invest in itself, because otherwise you're consistently just solving for zero. And you're never going to be able to take the next step of investing, and whether that's in people, whether that's in infrastructure, whether that's in children, bunch of different things to invest in. But that the goal of raising revenues isn't just get to zero. That's necessary, but not sufficient. And so different aspects of the report, we tied to different investments in priorities. And the priority at that time, stretching my memory, it's on one of the early pages, but I think it was investing in youth, investing in financial sustainability, and investing in sustainable municipal operations. I'm stretching, but it is in the longer report. And so we tried to identify where those investment opportunities were and match revenues with potential investments, so that it wasn't just raising a dollar to spend a dollar, but raising a dollar to invest the dollar in an outcome, not just in spending it. So
Thank you.
Did you have a question? Commissioner Segura?
A few, actually. Some of this is prospecting for examples of things that, that one might imagine doing here, but I suspect might exist other places. One that I know about is a split rate between land and buildings, and with the intention of essentially with the intention of raising the load on vacant and underused land. And I know that this was a thing in Pittsburgh a long time ago, but I believe it's had a little resurgence, and I wonder if you are aware of places.
I can't say off the top of my head I'm aware of other places, but I have seen that kind of policy enacted before. I think off the top of my head, I can't say what other places I'm not recalling, but generally as a policy, I have seen kind of the incentivization of trying to get land from vacant back into productive use. And that's very consistent with a good public policy. How it's implemented,
Mhm.
sometimes there are local
That
or
was-
state regulations that.
That was gonna be one of the follow-ups,
Okay.
to talk about, to ask
I
about.
can't tell you what the ones are in Rhode Island, but that is a major issue to understand before pursuing something like that.
Well, there's also, the distinction between underused land and underused buildings, which was where I was gonna go if you had.
And talking about one of the things that has changed in the last 2 or 3 years as you look at office space. Being in Philadelphia, right, and you look at vacancies, I'm sure Boston, New York, having the same similar issues. I don't know the extent to which that exists here in Providence, but. If it doesn't, my guess is that it probably will at some point, and getting ahead of that curve. I don't know that anybody's got it perfectly right yet. I think it's very much a learning laboratory right now. I think there's, as much as it's a challenge for communities right now, my sense is that it will grow. Because you have long-term leases that are being paid because they were signed before COVID, and I think when those leases are up, the payments will cease, and now you really have, it may be vacant right now, but it's at least being paid for.
Well, actually, the model I had in mind was not actually, finished office space that happens to be vacant, but buildings that are just almost derelict, just empty.
Sure.
But I have a similar question about, one of the things we look for is ways to, I mean, when property taxes were first a thing hundreds of years ago, property was a pretty good proxy for your income. That's no longer really true. But looking for better ways to make that true is something that and trying to establish a little bit of progressivity into the code is something that I think we'd be interested in pursuing. There's two ways that I can think of pursuing it. One is something that we have here, which is a circuit breaker in the state income tax, is a small refund for a percentage of your property tax, which is also extended to rent. And again, I'm looking for examples of similar things in other places and wonder if you're aware of any.
The short answer is it's really hard, and not everything is quite an apples to apples because
Of course,
certain state policies and whatnot. What I would say on property tax policy is that the law of unintended consequences often comes into play. And so without getting into specifics of a proposal, I would approach it with a very 360-degree view on anything, because there have been multiple instances where I've seen communities think we're doing something really that's going to help spread the burden in the right way. And either market forces or the way it was implemented didn't completely account for the impacts of spillover or whatnot and that.
well, I think this is generally true of tax policy.
Yes.
Period. I mean,
Absolutely.
we've already seen an example here where, a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about how the homestead exemption is a fine thing for homeowners, but it seems to have pushed a lot of burden onto renters.
Yeah.
I wonder, same question. I wonder if you're aware of more direct ways to put sort of a progressivity into a property tax, maybe different tiers of rate, maybe, or I don't know.
Yeah, without. I don't want to give you. I don't know enough about the city of Providence in the last 8 years to give you very specific advice in Providence. I would think generally, and in examples, I don't have great examples of that. I think they exist. I just don't have the knowledge of research off the top of my head. But I think the general parameters and part of why I tried to lay out some of those questions at the end of how to think about integrating equity into things that gets at some of that progressivity. So, for instance, sales taxes, generally very, very regressive. If you take certain you'll see different states will omit food or clothing or different things like that to make it less repressive.
Right.
Or you'll have a rebate, if depending upon how much, those kind of circuit breaker things. I think those are generally the tools in the toolbox, not to say that they're the only tools in the toolbox, but those are some of the frameworks that folks are at least consistently thinking about property tax, we develop a little bit harder. Especially as we start thinking about the impact on renters. On how much of that is passed along versus how much of it is shouldered by the property owner. So I hesitate to go too far because I don't have the specifics off the top of my head, but the general construct I can tell you is how I would think about it.
Oh, yeah, I understand. You know what I mean, these are things of general interest that I'm fishing for. What I'm doing right now is just fishing to see if there are, if you have examples that you can point to that I can investigate further.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have not done updated benchmarking on a lot of these things in the last 8 years.
Okay.
And most of the relevant things I've spent my time on in the preceding years have been over recovery.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you. Councilwoman Angela.
Thank you. Or Commissioner Segura is fishing, made me have two other questions that are maybe similarly fishing, but maybe for future conversation. I'm intrigued that it's like how we get at more granulated property taxes, and it does seem like there's a disconnect between property value and income, especially I'm thinking of specific people in my community who maybe bought their house 40 years ago, they're still in their house now, but their kids are all grown, they're gone, their house is too big for them. Rates have got, their property's worth a lot more than it used to, and they would love to move out, but there's nowhere in the community to go because we haven't built housing for so long. So we just like tax them at what it's worth. They're gonna get pushed out. They're gonna move to Cranston, they're gonna move to South County, they're gonna move to Florida. They'd like to stay in Providence, continue to pay taxes in Providence, but there's just like nowhere for them to go. Their income is super low. They're probably on Social Security or, some sort of retirement. And their whole network is their neighborhood. And so if there was some way to like triangulate between income and property tax, which maybe there is, I know we have exemptions for people above certain ages and things. So, and the other is maybe more of a question. So I'm just fishing. I'm just going to say both of them at once. Do we have the ability, you have some examples back here on like more consumption-based taxes, the like certain, does Providence have the ability to do taxes on services like pool and lawn maintenance or other things that are more of a marker of wealth? I'm seeing Larry or Tom shake his head. Okay.
So this is kind of a generic list of things, and those examples are really for consumption-based taxes. Those are really more geared towards like places that can levy sales taxes.
Yeah.
And what you exempt or don't exempt. So if Providence were ever to be able to levy a sales tax, right? That goes into the category of what are you essentially or willing to subsidize versus not subsidize?
Yeah.
And how much is regressive versus progressive from a tax policy standpoint.
Okay. Cool. Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? Commissioner Softon.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Your chart on page 13, the tenets of tax evaluation incorporating equity. I think is one of the simplest and also most helpful primers on a variety of factors to look into the analyzing tax policy. So, I mean, Michael's probably seen, the vice chair, DBA's, I should be more formal, has probably seen a bunch of these ways to try to analyze tax policy. I've seen a handful of them in a variety of capacities. This is as easy to use as I've seen, and I think is fairly complete. I'm particularly interested in, so thank you for providing this to us again. This is probably part of your original presentation as well. I'm interested in how we analyze the neutrality and efficiency and the unintended consequence theme that you mentioned. But for example, there's a broad base of economic activity in Providence that's not in the rest of the state. Hospitality, meal and beverage, entertainment. And if there were a surtax for the city of Providence, let's just say make the math easy of 1%, or make the easy of 1%, that might on its face seem like, well, most people are coming into the city to see, play at P-PAC and have dinner at Capriccio's and park at one of the Metro Park Charlie Myers lots. If they're gonna spend $400 for the evening for two people, and that's it, and they're gonna stay overnight at the Graduate or something, so they're gonna spend $1,000. 1% is probably not gonna change their plans. But even, how do we analyze whether that 1% broadly across that venue might decrease the couple from Stonington, Connecticut, that could go to Newport or come to Providence? How are there models or algorithms that are known to you in the municipal industry that might either be proprietary to which we could get access or might be publicly available, where we could try to get some handle on whether we're creating requesting an unintended consequence of diminishing the value? We see that all the time in the state. I mean, Rhode Island, like you might have been in state service when we did this, but we eliminated the sales tax on boat and marina services in Rhode Island, specifically with the goal of becoming New England and maybe even the Northeast's hub of marine trade services. And frankly, that was wildly successful. We are the hub mainly because of that reduction. We market that from Florida to Maine and in Europe. Have your boat serviced in Rhode Island, and we think of yachts particularly to take advantage of that. But it's this unintended positive consequence of that was all the little fishing boats up and down the coast, Long Island Sound. If somebody has just a very modest fishing boat, will drive from Connecticut to bring it to Warwick, Rhode Island to get it serviced to save them 5-6% service tax. And then they become familiar with the marina and they like the service. So my question is, are there any tools available that we could try to analyze whether any of these policies, creating tiers of progressive property taxes, or maybe an inverse progressive homestead exemption, the inverse, so at a certain point, your homestead reduces. I think there's some value to try to equalize that, but I'm always cautious of not knowing whether if government changed the economic structure, is that the tipping point that somebody says, okay, I live in Providence, I can afford the $15,000-$20,000 a year of taxes, but now it's $21,000. My breaking point was 20. That $1,000 is enough for me to sell the house and move to Cranston. How do you start analyzing those data points? Sorry for the long question.
No, it's a very good question, and it's one that requires a meaningful amount of analysis to think. And I have a series of colleagues who spend their time doing that. And that is a service we provide to clients to look at different issues, because that very same question comes up around sales tax, around tax incentives, state tax incentives, right? How many states have film tax incentives, right? Well, not everybody's gonna be Hollywood. Not everybody's gonna be Wilmington, North Carolina. Some of those are just subsidizing things that we're gonna have anyway. So, that's the inverse of then government's paying for something to happen that was going to happen anyway, I suppose, with what you're saying. But the short answer is that there's ways to model it, there are ways to explore it, there are ways to look at it. Some are fairly straightforward and some are pretty complex. It depends what the issue is and what the regulations are and the laws are like.
Thank you.
Has there been any discussion about you coming back and updating your analysis?
No, the National Resource Network was not funded by the Trump administration. I guess not the very first budget, still funded that, but so the National Resource Network was not existing.
75% of this study was paid
better.
for by. Yep.
And so the National Resource Network.
Just wondering what the cost would be to get the benefit of your information updated for us. Commissioner Stoltzman piqued my curiosity. particularly when you said you had colleagues that did that type of work.
Sure. Off the top of my head, I don't know the answer. I'd have to think about what the exact question is to then understand or give you some feedback on that. But certainly happy to have that conversation.
So there's no national, federal initiative or efforts to update any of this work? This structure, even post-pandemic?
Not that I'm aware of. No. The National Resource Network that has ceased to operate. My firm, PFM, still is very much alive. Happy to say.
Chief Mency, you had a question.
I do not, thank you, Madam Chair. I have a point of clarification for Commissioner Stolzman. Your point, Commissioner, was that the unintended consequence of that $1,000 night out at a 1% revenue generator or $10 would end up dissuading that particular party from spending their evening in Providence and maybe look for somewhere else. Is that more or less what you're trying to say?
Yeah, at what point does the elasticity stop? And
Right.
somebody says, oh, when you go to Providence, it's now more expensive than we used to think.
Yeah. It's something to pause because typically a hospitality tax is imposed on the premise that year over year, day over day, event over event. The attraction is because the host city is a world-class city, because it's an arts, culture, tourism capital that incidental to that. And then, so that's back to Mr. Williams' point. You would need a firm or someone to analyze data that's typical of cities who have an emissions tax. And it could be as large as New York City, which I'm sure that exists. And then you may have heard my comment a meeting ago. We'd be blessed if we were a sports town like our neighbors in Boston, where not so much admission tax, but just the economic generator of having constant motion all 4 seasons throughout the year. Then there's opportunity to pick or choose. How would an admissions tax? How would a ticket tax? How would some tax, a litter tax, God forbid, because the streets are getting traveled? You need that economic generator to determine the best way to impose a fee or a tax. And Madam Chair, if I may, a point of personal privilege with respect to Mr. Williams. His work is so uniquely valued here in the city of Providence. He worked with his DBAs and I and the pension obligation study group. It was the effort of his firm that brought that report into existence, and it was used really as the premise and the basis of the General Assembly here at the City Council. I think it was work that was well noted and well done. And yes, if there was ever opportunity to retain the quality of that work, I would certainly support that.
I would agree, and I want to thank you. You've done an awful lot for our city over the years, and I'm well aware of your contribution to our city. You guys had a question. I don't know whose hand I saw. Well, Chief Manson was speaking.
I was,
Commissioner Solaris?
thank you. I was only going to say that I have done incidence studies in the past. A lot of it comes down to judgment, and some of the judgment is value judgment in the assets that you have. Right? You're asking the question that you posed about is 1% enough to dissuade somebody? Is 2%? Is 10%? Or what it. And there are sort of methodologies for trying to derive an elasticity from other data and kind of make guesses about that. But ultimately, you find yourself doing things like trying to evaluate the magnetic attraction of something like water fire, right? Mm-hmm. And at some point you're like, at some point there is no way to find out except to try. The safest thing in these discussions is always to do nothing, which turns out sometimes it's not that safe, but that is there's a fear that I've spoken to in clients that I've had on the subject, a fear about, well, we can't do that because that's going to drive people to somewhere else. We can't do that because it's going to shut things down. you know, you can do the best you can, but at some point, there's this kind of intangibility about the attractions that you're talking about and your evaluation of how strong those things actually are that you really can't get around.
I think you also have to be careful about when a couple comes into town, and they're gonna spend $1,000. It's also the experience they have with our city. And is it beautiful? Is there glitter? Is there graffiti? Are there the mini bikes crazily driving around? So I think that has an impact too.
And all that
as far
smoke
as-
in the river. Yeah, some-
But you know what I mean, it's sort of a bigger, like what, if I came to town and I lived up in Boston, it's like if I had a bad experience walking in my car, it was creepy and smelly and. You know, there's graffiti everywhere, I might not come back, you know?
Mhm.
So I think it's really important for our city to. Think about a lot of the beautification stuff and. I don't know, not just like the actual event that people are.
Right, or having the funds to keep the maintenance. To keep the maintenance up,
Yeah.
to provide security, you know, those are tangible manifestations of not having enough money to do stuff. And so that's part of it too.
Very true. Anyone
Sorry,
else?
those were supposed to be questions to you.
I don't know that I have an answer that discussion didn't take care of.
Anyone else? Well said. Well, I want to thank you very much for your presentation. Do you have any? After being questioned, after giving the presentation? Yeah, pearls and wisdom, and obviously I've done this study for other municipalities. You mentioned a couple of opportunities. But is there anything that stands out as real success stories in other municipalities that you would think would be similar to Providence? That you could point to readily?
Frankly, having done this around the country, one of the things that distinguishes cities that tend to succeed, like, thrive isn't necessarily the right word, because you can struggle but still be succeeding, because the alternative can be far worse. Is the commitment of the people doing work and the informed approach for elected and appointed leaders to make the decision-making process. That is a differentiating factor. In those places that have a really hard time, often don't exhibit those that. And those that tend to do okay even when the circumstances are tough, tend to exhibit those. So I think the existence of a commission like this, the doggedness with which you're approaching these issues, I think is something that will set you up well. And I would urge you to continue. And I think consistently revisiting tricky issues like these in light of the circumstances that you're facing today is really important. And you know, I commend you for doing that, and I hope that work in Providence continues for years and decades to come.
Thank you. Well said. I would also like to state that this commission, this body, has the benefit of a collaborative initiative between the council and the administration, and a great group of committed commissioners with tremendous skill sets. So I hope that we get a good group of recommendations that come out of this meeting, because it is important. These meetings, it's important. And once again, thank you.
Thank you. Good reader in Philadelphia.
So with that, I would like to ask the commission, let's talk about our schedule on. I think we've got some folks that can't be in attendance for next week. Is that correct?
That would be me.
That would be myself too.
And the
Thanks,
chief
Larry.
is out as well. So
Should shut up and let you cover for me.
so just to give you some background, so I also asked for the reval company to come and make a presentation to us. We apparently, as a city, has just engaged them.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
They graciously offered to come to our meeting.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that was on Monday the 30th. So that's not a good day. I think we need the chief and Commissioner Segoras to be with us when we speak about reval, because it's a really important component of our work here. So that being said, I don't think we're going to meet the week of the 30th. Is that fair? So that brings us to the week of the 6th, and I am on pocket on Monday the 6th. I am available on Wednesday the 8th, November 8th. Does that present an opportunity? Does that work for everyone? The 8th,
It works.
that work for the vice chair?
Yes.
All right, so let's,
I'll check the calendar also, tomorrow.
okay, check the calendar and get back to me. I have it as available. I think I kept that date.
Did you get that far?
I believe I did, but that brings me to my next question. I need the administration to kindly invite our reval person on the 8th instead of the 30th. Chief, could I put that on your shoulders?
You certainly may.
Okay,
And Madam Chair, with due respect, while I appreciate you having reliance on the administration and myself, the city assessor has worked with the firm, and if you so choose to think differently, she and her deputy, Mr. Murphy, are available to lead that, to assist with the discussion of the reval company, if you believe it's in our best interest to get that meeting in, to save us additional meeting time for other matters. So I offer that because I have confirmed with Ms. Muscatelli and Mr. Murphy that the reval company is prepared to give testimony, and it will only be testimony, if I may say so, on policies and procedures associated with reval. Given that they are a brand new company this term, but they are the same company that did the second most recent reval. They can only speak about what they know, and they have not yet conducted that reval. So I don't know if that makes a difference to
it
yourself and the
does,
commission.
it does, and I think that what we want to do is invite Mr. Murphy and Ms. Piscatelli.
Muscatelli.
To make a presentation to this group as to what the city is doing regarding reval.
Okay.
So it's a broad discussion.
Okay.
In addition, we have a guest lecturer. Commissioner Segoras also has a couple of thoughts. He's done a body of work on revals that he'd like to share his perspective or a perspective on revals. And I think it's one big reval discussion.
Okay,
As long as you're willing to make a presentation to the group.
Absolutely.
Okay, awesome. So the clerk's gonna check on the 8th for us. If that's not possible, what do we do?
Let me have to look.
See, I have a 6 o'clock obligation on Monday. That's my regular Monday. So I could do it at 5, but I'd have to run out of here. So I don't think I have time. So let's shoot for the 8th. If that's
Great, all right, and I'll check that and we'll tune around and get back to you.
okay.
If that's not available, we'll talk about it.
Okay, so then the other discussions down the road, I would like to start to try to put shape and substance to some of our thoughts collectively about how to move forward. So in the interim, I'd like you to kind of be thinking about some recommendations. I think Seth made a really good presentation, and I really want to thank him. Because most of our revenues come from property taxes. I'm really intrigued with consumption taxes. There are policy implications, but I think it's an opportunity for us. And Commissioner Driver, you are absolutely right. Quality of life issues are really important, and we need to raise revenues so that we can invest in our city. And for us to move forward to attract commercial, to attract visitors, we need to have a thriving city where everyone is happy. That being said, we also have to make sure that our taxes are levied equitably. We have an aging population. We talked about, exemptions. I'd like to maybe look at what those exemptions are, and maybe if they need to be shifted. I've had the auditor doing some work on models, a lot of models on tax revenue. Some of them are emerging as very interesting, so I'm gonna have her make a presentation, but I want the auditor's work to be verified by the administration, Larry, so that's coming. We've done, we've looked, I think last week we talked about, the last couple of weeks, we talked about no homestead, reducing our tax rate. There's interest in that, obviously, from a realtor's perspective. You know, people at first glance look at our tax rate, they think it's high, they don't see the value of a homestead. There's a discussions that need to be had about what an owner-occupied person pays versus a non-owner-occupied, whether we need to try to shift, we've shifted the tax burden to the owner-occupied or the non-owner-occupied property over the years. You know, we looked at the history of taxation, and I've seen that growth. Is it time to try to maybe pull that back? Those are discussions we need to have, really meaningful. What else? So consumption taxes we need to look at. We need to look at our homestead exemption. Does it need to be tiered? Do we need to ask for everything? So what I mean by that is we asked for a tiered tax structure last in 2019. It passed the Senate. That tiered tax structure gave us the option to the ability to modulate our taxes. That helped considerably because we basically saw that when we modified our tax rate, you know, the impact was not felt equally. So we want to look at some models on tiered homestead if we keep a homestead. But I guess what I'm saying is there's a lot to be discussed. And I want to go through the exercise of looking at those models with all of you and seeing how, you know, those models may impact the lower value property, the higher value property. Do we get rid of homestead and just have one flat lower tax and everybody, there's an equal benefit, just as we would apply a senior benefit? Those are the things we need to discuss.
Madam Chair, if I can ask one fact
Please,
question.
jump in.
Do we have any sense of whether there's a broader base of economic activity or wealth, lowercase w wealth, assets to tax other than property? I mean, the notion that Commissioner Scores is right, you know, when the statewide education system started in the late 1800s, Horace Mann, Brown alone, you know, starts Massachusetts statewide school system. In Rhode Island, Brown and Sharp's factory on Promenade Street could pretty much fund half the school system. Schools cost a lot less, and one big factory could pay a lot of taxes at $1.19 or whatever the tax rate was then. It was $1.20 or something like that. But what we've done is we keep growing the government revenue side, and by changes of economics, nothing the subsidies done wrong. It says nationally the relative value of real estate compared to the GDP is declining. So it comes and goes, but even with property value inflation, you just don't keep up with government expense inflation. And so we're not in a sustainable tax base, regardless of what the rate is. So there'd be a commission, no matter what we do now, 20 years from now, I'd have to deal with this again, I suspect. And I don't know enough about value-added taxes or different transactional taxes, but it wouldn't, if we shouldn't distract ourselves from this tax, but it might not be bad if we were gathering all this data to gather things like transactional taxes on nonprofits. For example, if there was a small, broadly based medical procedure tax, a tax on transactions, you know, Brown buys pencils. I mean, I don't want to tax education, but they don't pay sales tax.
Do they buy a lot of pencils?
I bet they do. I computed with one of the examples I have. We haven't looked at this in detail, but the notion of a computer software taxes and different municipalities looking at how to properly tax computer hardware, software, it wouldn't, if we have start to gather some data here, I think that's about, even if we don't use it as a request, to start to become educated on what's the realistic tax base? For maybe Michael, maybe EPC has done some work on this, but.
Vice Chair DeBiase.
Commissioner Stolz was getting way too philosophical for me, so.
Oh, yeah, which means more taxes, so he does.
No, well, actually, if you think about it, the state's taxpayers and income tax have actually been paying more and more of this for the province schools, so
That's right.
so it's less and less reliant on the property taxes. I think, my interest in this commission was one, if we could improve the property tax balance and many of the things that I think the chairwoman was talking about and different councils were talking about, progressivity, vacant land and things like that. But at the end of the day, the property tax base is not sufficient. And it's actually not because of the tax exempt, it's that the property values are just not valuable enough. And so looking at these other forms of revenue, I do think this is a great start, but I don't think this is a very comprehensive view of how we can raise revenue. And my other observation is, given that I've been around a long time, I don't think the state is very likely to give Providence a local option. And that they will more likely want, this is why you're not going to have to worry about your unintended consequences. They're more likely going to want both that it applies statewide and that also that the state gets some of the money. So I very much like the admissions tax, the meals and beverage tax. I'd like to have more information about whether that, whether that 8% is already high. There is a mention here about housing and housing conveyance transactions. That's obviously something that I think the state needs to look at and, to capture some of that transactional value. But I do think we have to think more practically that if we're going to get the power to tax something as the city of Providence, it's more likely than not going to come with everybody else getting it. I can't think of historically many places where Providence has been allowed to go it alone with, for example, a parking tax. Or
We don't
because
get a special call out for being the capital city.
the General Assembly members will have to vote on this, and they'll be voting on a tax imposed on their constituents on the Providence budget. And so I just think the admissions tax has a beauty to it because most of the incidence is in the capital city. So if you think about that, and the parking tax, I think, has a lot of benefit, but you could also think of it as having to help pay for some of the state's transportation issues as well. So anyway, I think we have to think more. We need, and even if you total all these up, you're talking about like a few $1 million, several $1 million, and we're gonna have to be think a little bit more broadly about some of these things. So that's my two
Well,
cents.
when
Thank you.
talking about revenue, those were excellent comments. Thank you. As were yours, Commissioners.
No, I defer to the vice chair. It is redundant.
Vote on, so Chief Mancini can weigh in here, but, for the past 3 years, we've relied heavily on, revenue recovery from, ARPA.
Very
To
much
the
so.
tune of 19.
15 million in the last month.
Okay, part of that was 19 to 19. That's falling off the face of the earth.
That is correct.
So just that alone puts us behind the 8 ball for next year's budget. So we need to get real. And we need to find a revenue recovery system for us. Because it's going to hurt next year. So I think that's why that this commission is so important this time around. So I guess I'm encouraging everyone to think big. And you talked about the fact that you go up to the General Assembly and there's an ask, and the ask is going to be measured on how does it affect my community. Because legislators can be like that. But
Not local council.
council people
Only
always think what's best for the entire city of Providence, particularly Providence. But seriously, those are the things. So we're gonna have those conversations on, do we need some data? For meals and beverage taxes, what do we need to bring to the table to have, to further these discussions? Is there an ask this?
Yeah, I would also love, if we were gonna talk about the meals and beverage tax, I would love if someone from the local hospitality association could come, because I think there's also the other side of it, of. We have such an amazing thriving, food and beverage. Community here in Providence, and also it is easy for them to move to Cranston and Warwick and some of these other centers that are less expensive, so I wouldn't. The reverse side of your question, like what's the tax that gets people to not come? What's the tax that gets them? And I think Dan said we have some really passionate help.
That was my comment. I didn't think you were gonna have to worry about that because I don't see it likely that they would have any problems.
Yeah.
Only the surcharge.
Yeah, so that's a good point.
Anybody else? Pete, you got anything for us?
No, Madam Chair.
Okay, let's call it quits for tonight. Motion to adjourn. Made by Councilwoman Andujar, seconded by Vice Chair DeVries. All in favor? Any opposed? Ayes have it. Motion carries.